Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to see you all today. My name is Dustin Cormier. This is How to Rock Astrology, and today I'm very delighted to have a seasoned astrologer hanging out with me and talking about astrology. This is Dianne Garven. Thank you so much for coming to talk with me today, Dianne.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. It's a real pleasure. Now, Dianne, you're currently living in South Africa.
That's right. I was born here.
And you were born here in South Africa, born and raised. Okay, so it's wonderful to be talking to somebody who has the consciousness of South Africa. You've talked to me that South Africa is such a mixed bag of so many different cultural influences and national influences. And it's wonderful for somebody like me. I'm in Canada, close to Toronto. So it's wonderful for me to be talking with somebody who has the idea of what astrology is like in Africa. Culturally, you were telling me that there was a time in Africa where just like music, which is something that's also very important to me, music, many artistic things were kind of, how should you sanctioned, I believe.
Censored. Well, basically censored. The government censored everything before it came into the country.
Right. There's a wonderful story about a gentleman named Sixto Rodriguez, who is a big musician, I believe, in South Africa. Have you heard the name before?
Yes.
He's a huge story in America.
Rodriguez,
right
yes.
Rodriguez.
We had a huge following in South Africa.
Right.
So what was the famous song? Yeah.
Oh yeah, it was it's Sugar Man is one of his
Sugar Man,
songs.
that's right.
Right.
Yes.
So in Africa at the time, South Africa, around the 60s and 70s, there was probably a lot of censorship, and astrology was one of the things that was censored.
That's right.
Along with music and all this. So was it, the hippies of America in the 60s and 70s did correlate astrology with a bit of a countercultural arc.
Yes.
There's a lot of Christian, Catholic religiousness in America that kind of thought that there was an association of astrology with, more esoteric things and with.
That's right.
And that could be for better or worse. There are many Christian people who think yoga is something that's a little bit hairy. Yes. Which, the modern age is really blowing the dust off of a lot of superstition when it comes to this stuff. Now, it's lovely that somebody like you had your nose in the dust before it even got cleared. So that is very cool, Dianne. So just to give everybody a sense of who you are, Dianne, you have mentioned that you started getting into astrology around the time that you were 10 years old.
That's right.
I'd love to hear that story. I'm just to give everybody an idea of who you are. You started being interested in when you were young. Yes. It wasn't until the late 90s that you took it seriously. You got a teacher named Rod Suskin, who you studied with for about 4 years or so until 2001. Then you became a practicing astrologer.
That's correct, yes.
And you've been doing so for about 20 years now, I guess, then.
That's right, yeah.
Wonderful. Okay.
Long time.
Awesome, Dianne. So as I said, it's always nice to talk to somebody that has experience in the field of astrology, because astrology is very much one of those things that time is really such an important.
It's amazing how when you're younger, the astrology all technically makes sense and you understand that. But after going through a number of Saturn squares and a number of Jupiter cycles, you start getting a real understanding of how these planets actually function. And not only because of your own experience, but because of seeing it in the number of people you are continually interacting with.
That's what I was going to say, is that seeing your clients is, Saturn returns and affecting different people in different ways, what Saturn means to each ascendant of each person that you're talking to.
Absolutely.
This must give you a very informed idea of Saturn, because no matter what, before you've seen all these different people with all these different charts, you only really know Saturn through your own neurological experience of it, right?
Yes.
Okay, so that's that totally makes sense to me, Dianne.
Yeah. So the older you get, the better you get.
Awesome. Well, that is very exciting for me.
Absolutely.
Because it only gets better from where you are, right?
Yeah.
Well,
And
that's
you know what the
awesome.
most beautiful thing about astrology is it is happening whether you're aware of it or not.
Hmm.
Whether
This
you
is,
believe in astrology or not,
hmm.
whether you're aware of it or not, it is happening all the time. It never stops happening.
Certainly, yeah, wonderful. And that
Yeah.
I think that's an important thing to consider, because I think I often say that, different astrologers get into different things. Me as an
Yes.
astrologer, I try to focus on what is fundamentally going to be practically useful to me, because I know
Same.
certain elements that some astrologers do, like they really comb with a fine bristle comb on like what's going to happen to you next month and what's
Yes.
going to happen to you like month to month, and I know that that has its place, but at some level I like to think that whatever is going to happen to me is the astrology is
Going to
there no matter
happen.
what.
Yes.
My
Yes.
attitude towards it is really the best tool that I have in order
Exactly.
to deal
And
with
we've got to be very careful of becoming overly dependent and running to the astrology for every decision and every direction.
it.
And we really need to be very careful because that can lead us astray.
It is a very cerebral art,
Hmm.
at least in the theory of it. But
Yes,
ultimately, the theory is an armchair philosophy thing. The
absolutely.
practical realities of it are always right in front of us.
Yeah,
Now, do you
absolutely.
find that you get a lot of do you find yourself telling clients that a lot in your experience?
It depends on the client, you know. Some people are more open to that bigger understanding, and for other people it can turn the switch the other way where they completely shut off. So when
Uh-huh.
you're interacting with a client, you have to really assess where the client is coming from, without, not from a perspective of judgment, but from the perspective of allowing yourself to give them the information which will be the most acceptable for them. And that,
hmm
of course, you also have to get from the chart.
Like it's
So it,
real, but it is
yeah.
a you're teaching what's within to who's in front.
Yes, absolutely.
Got it.
So when you are sort of sharing information that could sort of cross a line in some way, we
Hmm.
just need to be able to assess whether the client will absorb that or whether they will reject it.
Wonderful. And that, I
Yeah,
mean, gosh, counseling is a huge dimension. It's really the yin to the yang of
yeah,
theory of astrology is, there's the message and then there's the massage. You know
yeah,
what I mean? Like, how
absolutely.
is it coming
That's
off,
a
right?
beautiful way to put it. Yes.
Thank you. That's an old 60s term.
Okay.
Okay, Diane. So before we get rolling here, I would just love to hear, before we started, you told me a wonderful story about how you got into astrology. Um,
Yeah,
Now, you said that you became interested in it when you were very young, at the time when astrology, like many forms of music and many forms of culture, were suppressed and
yeah.
censored. So can you tell us a little bit about what got your nose
So
into the books?
it was really my stepmother. She had been very fortunate in her youth to study outside of South Africa. She spent 5 years in Italy and traveling through Europe, and had at that time also been very interested in astrology, and had brought back books that were just impossible to get hold of in this country, sort of books that would teach you how to cast a chart, that kind of gave you an understanding of the house systems and the signs and how you incorporate all of that. But of course, being that young and reading that material, you
Hmm.
kind of like have all this information, but you don't know how to put it together.
Hmm.
And then this continued for a number of years. And then it was really, you know, when I left school, there were very few options. I couldn't study astrology
I
because there
see.
was just nothing
There was
available.
no
Went
internet at the
into an
time.
alternative career. And then in my late 20s, the opportunity came up to
Hmm.
study. And I've got to do this. It just felt like I was called to it.
And that was
And
the
I've never looked
gentleman,
back.
Rod Suskin, that was going through
That's
South
right.
Africa.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So Rod Suskin lives here in Cape Town.
Okay.
At the time, he was teaching in a classroom environment. Of course, we didn't have access to things like Zoom. There wasn't even those
Mm-hmm.
things weren't available. So it was in a classroom situation. Of course, now he does teach online as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very
Mm.
interesting. So at the time when you were just getting into this, like, did you have a lot of friends that were interested in your arcane knowledge?
Not really. It was very, I mean, talking about astrology, even in South Africa, was a very limited thing. Most people
Right.
thought you had a screw loose. There was like an apple missing from the basket if you sort of knew about astrology.
Cool.
But yet everybody knew me as the person who, when I first met you and you were introduced to me, I'd go, so what's your sun sign?
So you people knew that
Everybody
you were
knew
into
me
it.
as that person, you know.
Well,
Um,
it's a funny thing because, you know, in North American culture, the only real hot item that is debatably, you know, like, for example, I'm in Canada, and cannabis, the drug cannabis has recently come from being in a state of illegality to
yeah.
something that's accepted in the same way that alcohol is.
Yes, same in this country as well, actually.
Oh, it is. I didn't know that.
Well, not in
Okay.
the whole country, only in one part of the country, really,
So in a certain section of the country. Okay. So
which is Cape Town.
Cape Town, and cool, very interesting. So
Yeah,
is that where you are? Is Cape Town?
that's where I am, yes.
Gotcha. Okay, Diane, I'm with you. So the reason I'm bringing it up is because I've had the experience where this was something that was frowned upon and considered illegal by the government. And so there was an intrigue, especially when you're young and you're trying
Yes,
to, you know, you're dealing with, like, you know, parents, like how much of their protection is really
yeah,
protecting me, or how much are they just trying to protect themselves from unknowns that don't actually exist.
yes,
You know, there's a
yes.
lot of this when you're young, and us in Canada, as well as Cape Town, have had the experience of, for example, with cannabis, of something that we've all had. I've seen elderly people talk about this as a demonized thing, and then 2 years later they're taking it for their inflammation in their hip. You know, so it's just funny how sometimes society can be
Yeah, turn
topsy-turvy.
things around like that,
Now,
absolutely.
there's a huge interest in an extremely developed undercurrent of cannabis consciousness in Canada before cannabis became legal. Because it was known to be a good thing, everybody knew that the legality was silly, and it was exciting almost because it was forbidden in a certain way.
Yeah.
Now, I'm wondering if we can relate this to the experience of astrology for you as a young person at the time when it was being suppressed. Did you ever, like, have, you know,
I
were you
don't
ever
think it
at a,
was being suppressed to the extent that at the time I was aware of it being suppressed. All I was aware of is books were almost impossible to get hold of. The one book you could actually buy in this country was Linda Goodman's Sun Sign book.
okay,
And just about anybody who was ever interested in astrology who lived and grew up in South Africa had Linda Goodman's Sun Sign book.
okay,
So
because
there
that was
was
the,
but it was very, very, very limited.
yeah, yeah.
So it wasn't to that extent. It was more just seen as nonconformist.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so
Interesting.
it wasn't treated with the same level of, let's call it, rejection as cannabis.
Gotcha.
You know,
Gotcha.
because we
Okay.
obviously have that in this country as well, and now that cannabis has become partially legal in certain states or
Right.
certain parts, it's lost all of that sort of
The
negative
hanging on.
connotation.
Yep.
But it didn't have the same level of rejection that cannabis had, but it was
Got it.
still seen as, oh, you're weird, you know,
Right. Right.
kind of
Okay.
a like off the beaten
Because
track sort of thing.
that's not too different from
Then,
today.
you know, I was one of those kids that was drawn to those sorts of things. I was
Yeah.
very, really interested in what everybody else was interested in.
Cool. Okay. So, I mean, that you certainly seem like a mystical minded person. Now, you know, astrology really, like I often say, every astrologer is a psychologist without knowing it, but not every
Yeah,
psychologist is an astrologer without knowing it.
yeah.
So obviously, this wasn't just a countercultural screw you, mom and dad interest of yours. This was something that you really got into for the sake of a deep interest in
Yes. No, I
the.
really got into it because I was very interested. It fascinated me. The whole
Uh-huh.
story behind it, and even today, the story of how astrology evolved fascinates me because, I mean, it originated from people who slept outside at night who were looking up at the stars, the shepherds who lay outside at night, lay and watched how this developed. And I'm going back to, of course, millennia.
Yeah, you're going way back. Yep,
Um,
I'm with you.
and if you imagine that, and these people are starting to watch these things and see correlations. It's a magical way of interacting with the universe, of really connecting with the universe, you know?
Absolutely. I've recently been obsessed with Vedic astrology lately.
Oh, really? Yes.
Yes, which is its own, people
Yeah.
say that you have to bring the signs back 23 degrees and all these
Yes.
things. I
Yes.
still use tropical measurements, the same that
Do
you would.
you? Okay.
But I've included the yoga and Veda philosophy because there's
Okay.
interpretation and then there's measurement.
Yes.
So the Vedic interpretation I've been obsessed with for that's
But
the
Vedic
training.
interpretation is very deterministic.
Deterministic.
So it's very sort of, if you get this and this combination will create that. Then there's almost like, and look, I mean, that is something that I've often wrestled with and still often do, is this fate versus free will. How much is fate and how much is free will?
I'm with you.
Which the Vedic astrology is very much fate. It's all fated.
I feel
with our Western astrology. Sorry.
Oh, well, sorry, Dan. I just did want to say that I have a feeling that the attitude of fatalism is something like I would accord it with Indian culture, but I wouldn't necessarily accord it with what we would typically call Vedic astrology. Vedic astrology is a system of interpretation, which the Indian cultural attitude, we have to. So
you're just using the system, you're not using the interpretation.
I would say that's correct. I would say that's correct.
So you're using the technical understanding of interpretation.
Yep.
Right.
And really trying to be discerning about cultural attitudes and approaches towards.
That's very interesting, because there are a couple of Western astrologers here in South Africa that do it the other way around.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, where they use the Vedic chart, but they apply transits and progressions to it, and they apply a lot of Western.
I think I've heard that. It's sidereal Western almost, is how I've heard it.
Sidereal, yes, that's right.
So that, I mean, because for me, I'm not sidereal. I use tropical just like you do. And sidereal is really, it's a whole sort of its own thing. It has to do with the fact of the stars and how the progression of the equinox has caused the tropics to go off alignment with what the stars were once considered. Because the stars, as I'm coming to understand it, are really they're actually just signs. Like when you see
stars, the stars are constellations. Each one of there are a number of constellations. 12 of those constellations fall more or less within the band of the ecliptic.
Yes.
So in the Western, in the tropical zodiac, they are then projected onto that band of the ecliptic. See, so that's really what we're dealing with there. But they are, and those stars they're the fixed stars. They are when we refer to fixed stars, they are the stars of Leo and Sagittarius and various other ones as well, not all limited. So the stars almost form this fixed backdrop. So it's like when you've got a theatre production going, you have the backdrop of whatever the scene is. It could be a forest, or it could be a city. And then you've got the planets moving across that band, and those planets sort of will change because of how the Earth shifts and changes.
Certainly. And the idea that I would say tropical Vedic astrologers like myself are kind of vying for is that the stars themselves being that fixed object is kind of like this, its own axial thing that can spin, and it does whatever it spins, however it's going to spin. As I understand it, when those pastoral shepherds and shepherdesses were looking at the sky, they would observe over time that when the sun was here at this time of year, let's say spring, the spring equinox, then a person will be born with Aries energy.
Yes.
And that relates with the spring equinox, right?
Absolutely.
Now, at the time, they looked up and they saw a bunch of stars. Let's say this was 2,000-3,000 years ago. And they said, you know what? The people born when the sun is in this place reflect the energy of a ram. So what they did is they looked in the stars and said, you know what? That looks like a ram.
Yeah.
Because the people born when the sun is there
Yes.
are like a ram. Now the
Yes.
stars have shifted, and what was
Yes.
once called the ram, people kept a record of that because they thought the stars
Yeah.
signified what the ram was, but really it was the fact that the sun was in spring.
Absolutely.
So
Yes.
this is
Absolutely.
my
Yes.
understanding. If I'm
Yes. However, that does pose a challenge, because if you are using that concept, then when you come to the Southern Hemisphere, that becomes problematic,
this is
because it means that in your spring, that's our autumn.
yes.
So whereas if you use the sort of standard tropical system, because there's already a calculation that comes into play, we're talking about the beginning of a new season, but it doesn't necessarily have to be relating to spring, although we will attach all the spring qualities, even though you're born in March or in April under Aries in the Southern Hemisphere, you're still in Aries with Aries qualities.
That's right. Yes, that is the word, because it has to do with the fact that the sun and the earth are still lined up with that Ariesness. That part of the revolution of the earth between the sun that signifies the point of Aries.
Yes, absolutely.
So it has to do, I believe, with an alignment and relationship of the earth. People even say that it has like a chakras, the earth, as it's spinning around the sun.
Absolutely.
And this relationship is,
I would believe that. I mean, if you look at the Taurus, and the Taurus's shape and how that energy circulates, I mean, the earth has to have that too, which would then, like we do, would automatically make sense that there needs to be sort of certain energy points.
Right. And because as above, so below, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, cool, Dianne. So I'm glad that we talked a bit about this, because this is something that I try to do my best to talk about the astronomical reality, because it can be so different and variegated. But as a tropical astrologer, I'm interested even in the idea that one caveat I will say about myself, and this is a very common thing that you're going to find with young astrologers like me. I'm aware of it. I'd like to get into doing this at some point, but I haven't found the time. Most young astrologers don't necessarily use a telescope, and they don't necessarily cast a chart themselves. Most of them will use a software. And
neither do I. I learned astrology in the days when computers were just being birthed. And I started practicing astrology on Solar Fire when Solar Fire first came out.
Solar Fire?
Yes.
And was that one of the earlier
That was one of the early. Do you know Solar Fire?
I believe I've heard of it.
Yes, it's one of, probably, I would say, one of the best professional programs you can get.
Wow, no kidding. And
so that's what I've been using since, when I started. Yes, we were taught how to manually draw up a chart.
Yep.
But I have only drawn up charts manually for practice when I was studying astrology in the exams and that kind of thing. I've never drawn up a chart manually for a client.
Gotcha.
I've used a computer. I mean, you know how long it takes to draw up a chart manually?
I've heard that it's a hairy situation. I can't believe that
you could see no more than one client a day.
Yeah, no kidding. Thank you, Dianne. I appreciate you saying that, because I've never asked that question to somebody. Well, I mean, so you've always been using software as well, then.
I've always been using software, so I can't claim to have sat under candlelight with my astrolabe and all my measurements and trying to create a chart and then doing transits and progressions to that, and then you want to add in primary directions and solar arcs. I mean, sure, it'd take you a week to prepare for one client.
Right, no kidding. And then I guess astrology would be, I mean, you'd be more expensive, but there are other people using the software, and like, why do it, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so when you were first getting into astrology, then I imagine when you were younger, you were probably just, like sun sign stuff, probably, right?
Yeah.
Or you could probably even at least figure out your moon using an ephemeris.
Well, I understood that the various planets had their places in the chart, and the sort of signs had an effect, and the houses, but I didn't understand how to put it together.
You're right.
I didn't understand how to incorporate. I had these vague ideas of all these things. It's a young mind that's just trying to really understand really, really abstract and big concepts.
Absolutely. So, I find when a person, like when a baby is first starting to integrate into their understanding of language, you can hear words like the, before, go, stop.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
you hear them, and stop is the thing that I do when I want to do this. Go is the thing I do when I want to do this. Don't
Yes.
touch that is the thing when I'm not allowed to do that thing. But
Yes.
it's not until you explore the how to use one word with another word that you find out that, oh, the reason that the phrase "don't touch this" means this is because don't means not, touch means touch.
Yeah.
Like, you eventually learn all the elements of the language.
That's right.
By applying it. So
Yes.
when you got your teacher, Rod Suskin, is that when you first were challenged to apply the elements of the language of astrology in a way that you can see, oh my gosh, it does work?
Yeah, he was my very first proper introduction into starting to synthesize all of this, started to put together and give a deeper understanding of the process.
And so is Rod, I mean, if you don't mind us talking about your teacher, Rod Suskin.
Not at all. Please,
okay, sure. So he would practice the same sort of style of astrology as you.
Absolutely.
Does he have a psychological background, or is he like some astrologers get into it to teach predictive patterns of when a person might have periods of abundance or prosperity, whereas some people come to astrology to know what it meant when they had trauma when they were 3 years old because their father did this and their mother did this?
So he follows also a very traditional path with a very practical outcome, but also, of course, the deeper understanding of cycles and how we apply cycles in our lives and how we understand periods or seasons, let's say, of growth or fallow or whatever it is. So it's almost like a bit of a fractal where you start on the outside with the bigger themes and you just work your way in to smaller kind of periods and times and then, let's say, events. But I'm always, not that I don't predict events, but I'm very cautious of predicting events in a way that makes people feel it's without a doubt going to happen.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Because I mean, I do have a belief that our Western minds need to feel that we have some choice in how events are going to play out or experiences, that sort of thing. I think if you take that away, culturally, it becomes a very unhealthy thing.
Totally. Look at India.
I think we are a culture that needs to believe, whether it's true or not, whether we have freedom of choice, we need to believe we have freedom of choice. Otherwise, it also takes away hope. Certainly. And I think especially in, I guess in many different cultures, this idea of challenging our free will is something that probably raises more nerves than anything for people. This is probably why a lot of people will have this attitude towards astrology. Don't box me in. And it's, I don't want to know the future,
Right. That, I understand the difference there. That is one that I don't often think about. Many people don't want to know the future. Although, I mean, truth be told, a lot of people do come to astrology, again, not so much to know their future, but to digest their past. And a lot of people do come to it for that. But I imagine a lot of people think astrology is all about knowing the future with a crystal ball.
But you'll be surprised how many people come to astrology because they want to know how a certain situation is going to play out, or whether they should be, I don't know, selling property and investing in something else. And they come with all sorts. I mean, it's amazing how many people do actually still want that. So we've done the past. That was great. They really kind of love delving into that. But then they keep coming back because they are looking at cycles in the future and how things play out. So, it's a bit of a balance of both, I think.
I could see that makes sense to me, because, I'd like to ask you at this point as a sort of a practical theory question, I guess you could say. When a client comes to you, and I'm sure you've had this, I've had it myself, and I know when a client comes to me and they have a very specific set of questions, what I usually do is I kind of come through and say, for a first reading, a consultation reading, I like to give a general gist, a big picture of the chart, but I will try to answer the questions that you've asked within that. And I think eventually what happens is that I try to cater to their specific requests while still retaining what I typically do.
Well, here's the interesting thing is that I find I do exactly as you do. I prepare the chart, I look at the cycles, I look at the sort of history, I look at the natal chart, I get everything ready. I sit down with the client, and then I will introduce what I do, and I will do the reading with their introduction, their sort of, no, this wasn't, that's what, whatever. And then at the end, I go, right, questions. And 90% of the time, I have my clients going, well, you've answered all the questions I came with.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
So I think that it's a combination of really understanding the chart, but also really understanding the current cycle they're in, because the questions they're going to ask is going to relate exactly to what's going on in their chart. So when you've got that right, you can answer those questions without them even having to ask them. And the beautiful thing about that is, in astrology, it really allows the client to trust the astrology. Because if you are saying to the client all of these things before the client has asked the questions,
cool. That
is telling us that this art, that this thing that we have access to, is so clearly true.
Yes, and it's confirming their it's kind of letting down their defenses a little bit, because they can see that it's absolutely working.
Yeah.
And I guess that puts you in a place where you become a person who has useful knowledge for the person.
Absolutely.
And it's always good when the person recognizes that, oftentimes I find people at the questions they ask before they come to the session are kind of coming out of the fishbowl that they're in. Yes. And they don't realize really that they're in a fishbowl. And
Absolutely.
then they come to me and as an astrologer, and they see the fishbowl and they go, oh my God, I don't even want to ask the same questions.
Oh, right.
Right.
Okay.
Yes. So I feel that happens a lot too.
Absolutely. Yes.
So now that does make sense. What I was thinking of asking is, when you have a client and they really kind of, I guess it is what it is when you get a client and they're really fixed on asking you these specific questions about these specific things. Because I guess you have an eye for the dynamic reading as well as the natal reading. Do you have a way, is that usually what you do when a person comes in and they have a very hot set of questions that they want to ask in order to keep them in the fishbowl, and you can sense that? What would you typically do to kind of...
I would answer those questions as clearly and as practically as I can.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's where I said, if this is what's on the person's mind so intensely, they're not going to hear anything else you're going to try and tell them. Mm-hmm. So what you've got to try and do is you've got to give them as much information so that they can then start seeing things clearly. And then what often happens, the client will come back to me and say, everything happened exactly as you said it would, but not as I thought it would.
Right.
You see, so that's kind of where you got to be careful of that sort of, I almost want to say it's a boundary that you can't cross with a client, is you can't force them to believe something they don't want to believe.
Cool. Very
so
useful.
You really do need, and you need to try and make it as practical as possible so that they again are not feeling that you're telling them what to do,
or that
they
you're
need
making
to
them
decide what to do.
It's like you present them with possible realities, but the possible realities are ingrained in the mutual conversation about the life that they have, which you've both been talking about.
Yes.
And when they see your outside perspective on the situation that you're both talking about, this is my life and we're both here with it, as soon as they start to see the pins outside of their fishbowl, eventually I think, I guess the idea is...
the point is, what we've sometimes got to realize is that there's going to come a point where change has to take place. So let's call it, for instance, a Saturn square to the sun. Okay, sure. We both know that a Saturn square to the sun is challenging and it's hard, but it enforces some kind of change. So when you're talking to a client about that change, you can say to them, it's like hitting a T-junction. You're going to turn left or right, but you are not going to go straight forward. The choice will be left or right, no further choices.
Cool.
So that's kind of how I would explain it to them. If you go left, you can understand that that's how that would happen, because then I look at those configurations. If you go right, that's how that's likely to play out, because I look at the same configurations, but I apply it to the opposite side of the choice that they made or whatever.
Right, right. Because I guess a lot of the times in these situations, I mean, everybody just wants the right answer. And you can't always tell them.
There is no right answer. No.
Right. Yeah.
And of course, the other thing is, if you push to a point, then what you do is you do a horary. It's like, right, what is your burning question? What is the actual question that you want here? And then you pull up a horary chart for that moment. And it takes me probably around 3 to 4 minutes to kind of draw out the information of a horary chart. And then I can say to my client, yes or no.
Okay, cool. So you do the horary chart too. That's cool. Because how I see what we're trying to build here really is that as astrologers, we're not looking to give them a fish for a day. We're looking to teach them to fish so that it can be fed and not necessarily need to come for all the little annoying detail questions.
Absolutely.
Because how I see, I mean, those detail questions eventually are probably, once you've given them a sense of their backbone, they got the backbone. So at some point, you as an experienced astrologer, you would be able to tell me this more than I'd be even able to talk about it. I imagine that after a while, people start coming more perhaps for specific questions, as well as maybe a refresher.
Yes.
It's like,
they
Dianne,
come for,
I need a refresh.
They come for specific questions. But of course, what happens, for instance, if you change Fidaria cycles. So if you go from, let's say, for instance, your Mars Fidaria into your nodal Fidaria or into your Sun Fidaria, whatever it might be, when you change.
What is that word you're using? I'm sorry.
Fidaria.
Fidaria?
Fidaria, yes.
Okay, that's not. I don't.
Have you not heard of Fidaria?
That might be a concept I've never heard of, actually, Dianne.
So
could you spell it for me?
Fidaria is a Time Lord period.
Time Lord. Oh, interesting.
So what you do is, if you're born during the day, if you've got a diurnal chart, then the cycles will start with the sun. If you are born at night, the Fidaria cycles will start with the moon, and it works through, and each planet has a period, and they're not all the same. They can vary from 9 to, I think the shortest one is 9 and the longest one is 12 years. So they vary between 9 and 12 years depending on the planet.
Cool.
So the first period of that planet, you have that planet by itself, and then it moves into a subplanet, and it's divided over an equal amount over the amount of years, depending on the planet you're looking at. And those become your time lords. So what happens is the time lords will govern what the experience is going to be. Wow. So you come and see me, let's say, in your moon Fidaria period. The focus of all the things that are going to happen in your life are going to be moon stuff.
Wow. You know, the Indian
astrology from the moon. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dianne. I just wanted to tell you for my audience watching, Vedic astrology has a system that's similar to that.
The dashas.
You got it. Okay. You're already with me. I don't think it's astronomically the same though.
No, it's not astronomically the same, but it's a very similar
concept. Okay. I just wanted to thank you, Dianne. I appreciate your clarity there.
Say you start seeing me in your moon Fidaria cycle. And you've been seeing me for a number of years. Now you're coming to me and you're going to see me, we're flipping over from the moon Fidaria cycle into Saturn Fidaria cycle. That year is going to be very significant, and it's going to activate Saturn in your chart. So then it's going to be very appropriate to dig back into the Saturn stuff in the natal chart. Cool. So then we start talking again. So now they may have seen me for the first time 10 years ago, and we discussed Saturn, all those details. And yes, we've discussed Saturn transits, but now that the Saturn Fidaria kicks in, Saturn is really going to act in the chart. So then we go back to looking at the natal chart, unpacking that a little bit deeper. And now the person, of course, has aged, let's say, by 10 years. They've gained more life experience. They have a better understanding of Saturn. So now you can really unpack that particular period in the person's life so that they are not so needy or dependent on you, so that they really feel confident in understanding what is expected of them universally and how to navigate this particular period. Wow. So you always go back to the natal chart. So there will always be discussions from the natal chart, and very particularly as we change signs.
I guess that the natal
Planets.
chart will always have new information to unfold based on the present
Absolutely.
life experience that the person's having.
Absolutely. Yes.
That is,
Absolutely.
you know, Diane, I really appreciate that, because I think this is something I would have only absorbed from somebody with your amount of experience. You know, I want to ask you, you know, there's a funny, when you have the experience that you do, I see that you are learning to put little widgets of, how am I trying to describe what I almost think of, like, okay, an arborist, a person who's into trees. They put a little tag around it so that they, you know, 8 years later, they're going to come back and see that tag and see how the tree has grown around it.
Yes.
In the same way, when you are talking to a client in your level of experience, have you learned that, you know, it's the first or 1 or 2 or 3 sessions with this client? Let's say it's the second session that you're doing with them. And let's say this ends up being a client that you've done 8 sessions with for like you. Okay. Are you thinking about the fact within that like second session, are you thinking in your head, like, okay, what we need to talk about right now is that you're in your Saturn period, because you are going to be experiencing things related to Saturn, and think about the fact that
now the thing is, I don't use the word Saturn.
Oh, really?
What I would use is, I would use the word that attaches to the house and the meaning of Saturn.
Okay.
So I'm not going to use the word Saturn, because the other problem is with doing that with your clients is that all they hear is the astrological jargon.
Yeah. Yep.
And they don't understand that. And it shuts their brain down from absorbing what you're trying to say to them. So let's say, for instance, you've got a 10th house Saturn. I'm going to talk to you about your period of your life is changing. You are going into the period of your life where you're now going to be dealing with issues in your career, depending on whether Saturn is well placed or weakly placed. So then I would say, for instance, a great example is a mother who's had 2 children. She's, say, 36 years old. She's got Saturn sitting in her midheaven, and now she's starting to get itchy. She wants to start going back to work. She's been a stay-at-home mother. Now she wants to go back to work. You know that she is not going to engage with her career fully and completely until she goes into a Saturn Fedaria, which in that particular context would be at the age of 40. Right. If she was born during the day, then she starts her Saturn Fedaria at 40. So you just say to her, well, look, you're probably going to dabble in this and dabble in that and play around with this. And you've got this cycle coming up, which might be a creative thing, but you're only really going to get back into a career and start integrating that career into your life when you go into this particular period. Right. So now you've got a person who's not feeling all anxious that I've got to do something, I'm getting to it. Now I can go, okay, so I've got a bit of time left to see what I really want to do, so that when I do get back into my career, I'm doing something that I'm actually bringing value to my life, rather than getting into the rat race and just feeling that you're on the rat wheel and just running in circles. Wow. So I almost even see, like, you know, it must be an amazing thing where, you know, for example, if you know that a person's going to be going through that Saturn period in the 10th house when they are at 40, you know, this could help with something like, for example, if Saturn is transiting Capricorn. Capricorn is the natural 10th house in a way, and somebody could be experiencing Saturn transiting through Capricorn and they're 32, and they're thinking, you know, like, I'm having all these things related to my career, and I need to ground my life in this way related to Saturn and Capricorn. You can say that there is an importance with regards to what you're at, but it's not going to fully fructify as an important issue until you come into your Saturn period when you're 40 years old. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so this must be very clarifying, because I know astrology, you're speaking to, gosh, it's like you're speaking to different chapters of the book. Absolutely. At the same time. It's exactly what you're doing. And you know what? It gives people a huge amount of relief. It's like this burden is lifted off their shoulders. It's like, I can actually breathe. I don't feel this pressure, you know, because we live in a modern society where everything has to happen instantly, you know. Right. No kidding. And what we have forgotten, that the planet cycles have never, ever changed. Saturn takes 29 years. Jupiter takes 12 years. No matter what we do, that is not going to speed up. So in terms of development of things, when we start looking at that, we can see the bigger picture, and we remove that anxiety around everything has to be sorted out and done by tomorrow. Or I'm a failure if I haven't succeeded by the end of the year.
Certainly, certainly. And astrology is hugely useful for that
Yeah,
because I guess humans are just almost Uranian in that
yeah,
way. We are this kind of
absolutely.
this pressured consciousness that wants
Yeah,
to experience novelty and ergonomical design faster.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
That's definitely sounds like humanity.
Yeah.
Okay, Diane, that's very awesome. I'm very glad to be, I love this idea of understanding the high level of experience of somebody like you, who, like, I love this metaphor of tying a band around a tree
Mm,
and then seeing that same band 8 years later, so in the
yeah.
sense that you could talk to your client or like I said, at that second session, you'd be referring to a certain thing. And then, 3 or 4 sessions down the road, the person experiences, let's say, their Mars period, and they
Mm.
say, last time I was here, you told me I've got to be this kind of person, and like it's my life is changing and has made that impossible. And you
Well,
can
you see, I think that I would like to just stop you there because
sure go ahead.
it's not about being this kind of person. It's about being who you are. This is
Gotcha.
already there. You are already this.
I do
It's
agree
about
with you there.
acknowledging that and
Yeah.
surrendering to that and using that in the way that it can most benefit you. Also understanding, though, when we are in malefic periods, like a period ruled by Mars or ruled by Saturn,
Mm-hmm.
you will have glimpses of, let's say, for instance, my most difficult years of my life were my 30s.
Mm-hmm.
In my 30s, I was in my Mars Fidaria period.
Mm.
I have got Mars in Libra debilitated, and it opposes Saturn in Aries debilitated. My
Gotcha.
Mars years were extremely difficult years. I achieved some great things during those years. I
Mm.
had some great moments, but for an overall, they were very, very difficult years for me. And
Mm-hmm.
that didn't mean it was years of failure, but it was years of having to activate that Martian energy opposed Saturn.
Certainly, and that was an important for
See,
you at the time.
so, so it's about understanding what that Mars is. It's already there. It's not being something else. It's about being who you are and taking that energy and surrendering to that and working with that energy.
I
And just
see.
understanding this will be hard. This is your hero's journey. This is the battle that you have to fight because it's Mars. So
And
that's what you're giving people. You
it
understand?
is, yeah, I understand. Yeah. And if I understand you correctly, uh as again, as a Vedic minded person, the whole Vedic philosophy is all about self-realization.
Yes.
Of course, the self does go through changes, but it's the
Yes.
same self within that is going through the shell of these cycles, these patterns, and these
Absolutely.
changes. In the same way as,
Absolutely.
like you could ask a person, I find that I change a lot through the seasons. If
Yes.
I start off in spring today, February 9th, and I try to align myself to what I think my life is going to be, it's going to be Dustin, but it's going to be the Dustin myself that has just gone through winter, that has just been
Mm.
freezing and hibernating and is now thinking of my life in this spring way. It's still me,
Absolutely.
but it's me through a certain shale. Now, if I ask
Absolutely.
myself that same question in the heart of July, when I've been having some drinks with my friends and I've just been clearing and opening my heart to the summer heart energy, and I ask this question again of like, who am I? What am I doing with myself in my life? And if I go to an astrologer at this time, it's going to be something different than who I was in spring. And it's the same thing with these cycles. You're
Mm.
ultimately teaching, expressing the newness of the same old self
Mm.
every
So,
time you see
so
something.
yes, in that same way, what changes is the planet that is activated. So it brings those issues up. So it's who you are,
Mm.
what you are, but one different aspect of yourself now being dealt with or being presented to the world.
Mm.
So that becomes really important. It's not in changing, it's understanding that this energy of this particular time carries this rather than that.
I see. So if I might
Yes.
if I might iterate here, Diane, this shows me the importance of understanding the difference between natal astrology and dynamic astrology, because
I don't think you can actually separate them.
Very interesting.
You know, they are, because everything is born from that original natal chart. I'm not sure if you have looked into or you're aware of zodiacal releasing.
I'm intrigued by it. I'm going to write it down.
So zodiacal releasing, without using transits or progressions or solar arcs or any of the other techniques, only uses the natal chart.
Mm-hmm.
It can talk about events and periods in your life using the technique of zodiacal releasing from the moment you were born for your entire life. Because it works starting with a much bigger period. And again, these periods are divided according to the sign, the actual sign, and they vary from 8 years belongs to Aries and Scorpio. No, sorry, 8 years belongs to Taurus and Libra. 15 years belongs to Aries and Scorpio, etc., etc. But then you apply that same on a smaller fractal, and then you apply it to a smaller fractal, and a smaller fractal, and a smaller fractal. Now, you are not using any other techniques other than the natal chart. So let's say you are now entering into a 30-year Aquarius period, because the Aquarius period is very long. You're entering into a 30-year Aquarius period. Within that 30-year Aquarius period, there will be smaller periods that get broken down into Aquarius, Aries, blah, 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 and go smaller and smaller. So let's say you've got Saturn in Aquarius. Okay, you've got an exalted Saturn, or in its rulership in Aquarius, so it's a very powerful Aquarius. It's got the sort of dynamic energy of Aquarius about free speech and, you know, progressive thinking, etc., etc. So you can imagine when you're in that period, that period is going to deliver very good things for you, depending on what you're looking at and how you're interpreting it.
For sure.
But let's say, for instance, that Saturn is squared by Venus in Taurus. Okay,
Natally.
that will also affect that particular period that you are in. And you can, again, using that fractal of breaking it down to smaller and smaller increments, predict an event or something that the client might be asking you about. Will I win the court case? This is going to be the play out. You use that technique. You have not applied anything else to the chart. You have only applied what is already in the natal chart.
Right. Interesting.
So you can't actually separate dynamic astrology from natal astrology. Like, for instance, when you are looking at a Saturn transit squaring the sun, you have to consider the sign natal Saturn is in, the issues that natal Saturn comes with.
Right.
Then you apply that to the Saturn position it currently is and its rulership, whether it's detrimented or in good rulership. All of that has to then apply to that Saturn square the sun on top of sun's actual position and its ruler and blah, blah, blah that goes along with it.
Wow. No. Oh, so that totally makes sense to me.
So you you cannot separate dynamic from natal. They go hand in hand.
So you really, when you're interpreting a natal chart, you know, like if we look at the natal chart of a dead person, you know, and try to think about who they were, you really can't get a clear picture that's solid in any way, because that natal chart fluctuated throughout their whole life.
Absolutely.
If I'm reading,
and I mean, that's where you look at solar return charts, where you apply the solar return chart to the natal chart in terms of what the timing of that life is going to be about, you know, and then you apply your perfections to it and you apply your Fidaria to it before you even started looking at transits and progressions. And the solar return chart is just another sort of click on the dial of the natal chart, as is the progression chart.
The progression chart, yeah.
You know, so the solar return chart, of course, is out of that natal chart, because everything in that solar return chart has to refer back to the natal chart.
Right. Very good, Dianne. That's amazing. Yeah. So is this, you know, when you're doing a reading for a client, do you find yourself, I mean, because, you know, as you've already kind of mentioned, I imagine that, you know, our clients are not dialers of millions of dials at once like we are. So when you're talking to a client, do you find that it comes out very much with like you trying to get them to see where they are on this bingo ball game, or do you mostly just come from a heart-centered place? I mean, everybody has to come from a heart-centered place in astrology, but maybe you listen to the particular client listen to their concerns and needs, and then you'll have a different approach.
I think my most important thing, my approach with my practice of astrology, is to listen to what the client is truly asking you, what the client really wants. There are people who come who really want to dig out the natal chart. They're not interested in the dynamics. They're not interested in the prediction. They really just want to understand their natal chart, or they really want to understand a particular issue in their natal chart. I find this very often when clients have difficult family situations, that family situation can be an ongoing issue throughout their lives. It comes up time and time again, and those are the clients who really want to unpack that. And then you get clients who come in, and you can see, as you're talking about that natal chart and wanting to really get into the natal chart, they just want to know the stuff that they want to know.
Right.
And ultimately, we've always got to remember, you're only as good as your last reading was. Which is from the perspective of the client. You might think that you've had a terrible reading and the client thinks you've had a great reading. You might think you did a great reading and the client didn't like the reading because you didn't give the client what they wanted.
Right. No kidding.
So that's the most important thing, is to give your client what he wants, not just saying in a people's pleasing way, in the terms of saying yes to everything and yes, don't worry, you'll get that and you'll get that. Be realistic about these things, but give them the answer to the questions that they are asking.
Yes, certainly.
It's like if you go into a store and you say to the guy, I want to buy the Pink Floyd t-shirt on the rack, and he gives you the AC/DC
or AC/DC,
you go, I want the Pink Floyd, I don't want the AC/DC.
And it can't be a good exchange, no matter how he's convinced, like, I have the best t-shirts in town.
And it's still black, it's still a black t-shirt.
Right.
No, I want the Pink Floyd t-shirt. So it's exactly the same thing.
Wonderful. And that almost makes me feel...
You could do an amazingly deep reading on the natal chart, but if the client doesn't want that, the client's going to walk out and go, well, that was no use to me.
Yes, I totally see that. Yeah. Like, I almost see it as like, just like how, like, anybody who's a potential lover and wants to consider themselves a lover, just because you had one bad session with a client doesn't mean that you're not a good astrologer. It sometimes means that the aesthetics aren't right.
Absolutely.
And probably a big point that I think I'm absorbing from you, Dianne, and this is one of the, I find myself ending most of these interviews in the same way, which I think is interesting. All of us astrologers have different ways of computing the data. We all have different ways of doing things. And our clients know this. Our clients, and it's good for every client probably to see different astrologers. And this is why it's funny. I have Saturn in Aquarius, and this is part of the reason why I think about things in the way that I do. It seems to me one of the great things that a client can do for their approach to self-realization through astrology is to recognize that you don't want to get too lost in the details. If you really want to find an opening in your heart, especially because Venus is really the guru of Earth, if we want to follow the right experience of life on Earth, we should follow the path of Venus in Pisces. Venus in Virgo thinks too much about opening their heart to these specific little details and results of things. Venus in Pisces just lives by the heart and says, what do I, at a heart level, when a client comes to an astrologer and is just trying to open their heart to the truth that they're experiencing, they'll see many different symbols, but ultimately what they should be looking for is for the astrologer to engage that heart space that cannot be put finitely into any specific detail, any arc, any cycle. Because then when that client goes from one astrologer, if you get a certain piece of your heart from that astrologer, it'll always be there. No matter what type of astrology that astrologer practices, a piece of your heart will reflect in them. And if you go to another astrologer, if you hold that same place, it's a color by numbers picture. Eventually it begins to look like something clear, right?
Yeah, totally.
Wonderful, Dianne. Well, I am really riffing off of the wisdom and knowledge that I think that you've been imparting with me throughout this whole session. I really appreciate you taking the time with me.
My pleasure.
We're at about an hour right now, Dianne. It's been an absolute pleasure for you to come on my show.
Yes.
So thank you so much for your time. Before we sign off, I did want to ask, is there anything else that you'd like to add to our discussion, to our session before you go?
No. So you're in your Saturn return then? Your
Yes, I
first
am.
Saturn return.
I sure am.
Is
And
it is it in beginning, or is it happened, or is it?
I'm right at 0 degrees of
Okay.
Aquarius.
Okay.
So I'm kind of, it's halfway through Aquarius-ish right now.
Yes, that's right.
And I think it's been doing nothing but good things for me.
Yeah. Well, I would imagine it should do.
Certainly, yeah. Especially I think once Jupiter got out of Aquarius,
Yes.
I'm a Leo rising and Jupiter's in my 8th house.
Oh, right. Yes, I could see you Leo rising. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
Same
thank
with
you.
me. I'm also Leo rising.
Are you really? Oh, I wanted to ask. Wonderful. Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Well, Diane, I appreciate hanging out with you so much, especially knowing you're a fellow Leo. I almost
Yeah.
think it's interesting. What I wanted to say is that I do feel blessed to have been able to connect with you. And I think it's
Thank
because
you.
my Jupiter's in Pisces, which is a good place for Jupiter. And that's our
Oh,
8th house,
beautiful.
right?
Yes.
That kind of being where our the 8th sign from Leo is. I feel that
Yes.
there's, I feel blessed to have connected with you through Jupiter.
Beautiful. I feel blessed to have connected with you too.
Wonderful, Diane.
Lovely.
Now, for everybody watching, Dianne Garven is somebody that you can find online. I'm going to do my best to put your website and your all the social details that I can in the description so that everybody who's watching can see what you're all about and connect with you from there, Diane.
Thank you very much. It was lovely chatting to you.
My pleasure, Diane. Is there any website or anything you'd like to point out before we go? For people to get in contact with you?
Oh, for people to get yes, they can just my website. Sorry, it's Dianne Garven Astrology .co.za.
Gotcha. .co
ZA.
Gotcha.
Sorry, I think you guys pronounce it Z, right?
I'm Canadian and I try to go for Z. So Dianne Garven Astrology.
Just Dianne Garven. It's abbreviated. Dianne Garven.
Dianne Garven Astrology.
.co.za.
Perfect. .za. Sweet, Diane. Well, thank you so much again for hanging out with me today.
Thank you very much.
I'll stay in touch with you. If you'd,
that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, maybe we could do this again because I loved rapping with you and I love being able to share the experience of somebody like you on my show.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It was lovely chatting to you. Cheers.
You too, Diane. Have a great day. Have a great night.
Bye. Bye.